What better place to start talking about Louisiana than with its culture? It's such a very dynamic state that we live in. Um, your vocabulary. Make sure we are reviewing these things. Fe Dodo, we're going to see a little bit down the line. Some of you have been asking about that. We'll also look at the music influences and many of the aspects of the culture of Louisiana. Here, first image that we see, that is a reflection of our culture. We see in Rapids Parish, one of the older churches. Religion is a huge part of Louisiana culture, as we will see. Culture includes religion, music, food, clothing, language, architecture, art, literature, games, and sports. All these elements combine to make a very interesting culture for Louisiana. First, looking at religion, Louisiana was first a French colony, therefore making us a Roman Catholic colony. Then later, we are handed over to the Spanish, which was also Roman Catholic. And then we were handed over again back to the French, and French still remaining Roman Catholic. That happens until 1803 when we buy Louisiana from the French, from Napoleon. We pay 15 mil. And when in 1812, Louisiana Territory becomes, this part of the Louisiana Territory becomes the state of Louisiana in 1812. It is no longer officially Roman Catholic. It is becomes a Protestant state because the United States was Protestant, or it mostly Protestant in heritage. Louisiana, historically, North Louisiana and Central tended to be more Protestant, and where the original colonies were with the French and Spanish and Acadiana, Florida parishes, New Orleans, that tends to be where the strongest hold, even still to today. The largest percentage of churchgoers are Roman Catholic. And in Louisiana, a recent statistic, 2012, has it is 67% of Louisiana or churchgoers. So nice, and one of the largest percentages in the United States. Okay, coming back to here. There's also, in more recent times, we have a little bit more of a dynamic group. We also include Islam and Buddhism. It's kind of not a huge percentage, but it is a percentage now in Louisiana. Traditionally, we had few have come and gone with the Jewish faith here. Never a huge percentage that were Jewish. Usually the Jewish synagogues would be located in the larger cities. There's definitely one in Baton Rouge. There's some in New Orleans. There's some in Shreveport. Music in Louisiana is probably, outside of Mardi Gras, outside of our food, it's probably music that would come in third, being the most defining thing about our culture known throughout the world. New Orleans is the birthplace of jazz. Jazz is a kind of improvised music with strong rhythms and syncopations. Brass bands and piano players helped to create this new sound. Jazz has spread across the planet, an ambassador for Louisiana culture. In New Orleans, jazz funerals for musicians feature marching groups called second lines. The music of contemporary jazz, greats like the Marsalis family, owes much of to the music of the earlier artists. So we see here that it is jazz that helps to define Louisiana, particularly New Orleans, throughout the world. We are the home of jazz. Another major influence is the blues. It is a link to to our past, this music style is based on black folk music, especially on the chants of the plantation workers. So blues finds its origin where it looks back to the slave times, back to the plantation life and the rhythms that the African slaves who were working created out on the fields as they were toiling away on the plantations. Those rhythms, along with instruments such as the guitar and the harmonica, combine what we know as blues. Later, horns were added, and once the horns were added and the tempo changed, it became known as rhythm and blues. So originally, blues has its its origins in plantation life. Originally, we're looking at the guitar and the harmonica for the blues. When it changes, so the evolution of blues, so as it changes, then we saw the introduction to horns, changing it to not just blues, but rhythm and blues. Kind of more so what we know of it as today. In the 1930s, cultural anthropologists, which are scientists who study human cultures, toured the United States collecting folk music. The blues music Alan Lomax recorded in Louisiana is now part of the Smithsonian's Folkways collection. To talk for a minute, 1930s, this is after the Great Depression, and there were plenty of public works organizations created to give artists and skilled people in writing and music jobs. So this was part of the pen's not working here. And it's going to draw a bunch of lines now when it catches up. In the 1930s, it supported the Public Works Association, giving jobs after the Great Depression. Continuing, one of those recorded in Shreveport, a musician named Huddie Ledbetter, better known as Leadbelly. A statue of him still stands in Shreveport. So we have some historically famous people to associate with blues. We have Huddie Ledbetter, and we mentioned before Alan Lomax. Another famous form of Louisiana music comes from Cajun bands. I'm sure some of us have heard Cajun music from maybe festivals that we've gone to, or maybe within our own family. It is what defines Cajun music. It is music that is sung in French, usually accompanied by a fiddle, triangle, and the accordion. Cajuns who are descended from the Acadians learned to play the accordion from the Germans who moved in southwest Louisiana in the 1880s. So we see Cajun bands. They sing how? In French. Their instruments are the fiddle, triangle, accordion. The early Cajuns often held dance parties at their rural homes. Entire families came out, and the young children were put on blankets on the bedroom floor. They were told to go to sleep. So when the adults were ready to dance, the kids were told to go to sleep on the blankets, and it became known in French as the fée dodo. This became known as the dance parties, and today the fée dodo refers to a Cajun dance. So this is the story behind how that interesting name came associated with certain types of Cajun dance. Zydeco is a special music of French-speaking African Americans of South Louisiana. Much like Cajun music, the song is sung in French and played on an accordion. An added instrument, the rub board, is used for rhythm, and we'll see a picture of a rub board in a little bit. So the Zydeco is kind of the African American French-speaking version of the Cajun band. So Zydeco is more so the African Americans, sung in French as well. And they got a really cool instrument called the rub board, and we'll see a picture of that. Country music is part of the heritage of North Louisiana. In the days before television, when people gathered for entertainment, musicians brought their instruments. So kind of like how we looked up here, how in the North was mostly Protestant, the North is also mostly country music as well. It's a lot more popular in North Louisiana. Okay, continuing. Traditional Southern music developed into bluegrass music, and so Southern country music developed into bluegrass music, and then into modern country music. So in South Louisiana, we had this music term called bluegrass, and also bluegrass extends into Mississippi as well. Especially, you get a unique blend of bluegrass when you go into the Mississippi Delta. You get the Delta bluegrass. Country music and blues were adapted to become rock and roll. So the origins of rock and roll are found in two forms of music: country and blues. Country and blues make rock and roll. Rock and roll started in New Orleans as early as the 1940s with Fats Domino, Little Richard in the 50s, scored a lot of good hits. Jerry Lee Lewis, who is cousin to the local pastor in Baton Rouge, Jimmy Swaggart. In addition, the Louisiana musicians here influenced throughout the world. A later generation of those who would actually take rock and roll to a whole nother level. Groups such as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. They were inspired and learned many of the rhythms and sounds that came out of the Louisiana musicians. Early rock and roll musicians started out singing gospel music. Example is like with Jerry Lee Lewis, who became a pop rock guy starting in the 50s. He started out just like his cousin Jimmy Swaggart, singing gospel music. Gospel music is church music that blends elements of folk music, spirituals, hymns, and popular music. You can hear gospel music in churches throughout Louisiana every Sunday morning. Songs sung in African American churches preserve the old spirituals and add contemporary music. Rural churches in North Louisiana feature gospel quartets. Some of our churches, even here in Ascension Parish, also are really big with the gospel quartets. That's when you have maybe 3 to 5 people all singing, sometimes with music, sometimes mostly not with music though, singing at different in different tones, almost like a orchestra, to gospel music. More formal classical music also contribute to musical sounds of Louisiana. Orchestras have been created. That's been part of our culture since the colonial days. Today, the most famous Louisiana orchestra is the Louisiana Youth Orchestra. Community brass bands were popular at the turn of the 20th century. Today, high school bands perform concerts and provide the marching bands for local parades. Music continues to add a tempo to life everywhere in Louisiana. So here in Louisiana especially, we're really big on the marching bands. Even in our own high schools, we can see their popularity. Okay, continuing with food. Newcomers and visitors to Louisiana usually comment on the music and the food. Louisiana food is considered one of the best elements of our culture. So one of the best elements of our culture is our food, and it is spicy. The food of Louisiana has spread across the world in recent years with Cajun restaurants in places like even Salt Lake City, Utah. The food most identified with the state is actually the Cajun and the Creole food of South Louisiana. So kudos to us in South Louisiana. We are what makes Louisiana food popular throughout the United States and even throughout the world. Until recently, residents of North Louisiana ate more like neighbors in East Texas and Mississippi. People north of Alexandria were more likely to eat fried chicken or barbecue. For many years, crawfish were not considered food anywhere outside of Cajun country. Fish fries featuring catfish took the place of the crawfish bowls. Today, boiled crawfish is served throughout the state. So crawfish used to just be a Cajun thing. Now it's throughout the state, and it's pretty much well known throughout the United States that we eat those interesting little critters. Okay, in the next video, we'll look at section 2.
Einstein, James Dean, Brooklyn's got a winning team. Davy Crockett, Peter Pan.